What Aristotle means here by honor is political or military honor, the type of honor that we would associate with, well, maybe not our current politicians, but statesmen of the past, maybe a George Washington or an Abraham Lincoln. Like I say, probably not our current set of politicians, but that's another story. Or you could think of honor as having to do with military personnel, someone who's given their life to public service, who's served their country, who's served their community. That's what Aristotle has in mind by a life devoted to honor as being one that constitutes happiness. Well, Aristotle thinks that honor is noble and service is a good thing. But he also points out that honor itself really depends upon somebody else, right? So in order for me to receive honor, I'm dependent upon other people who recognize my greatness, right? Not that I'm great or anything, but I think you get the point. So honor itself is ultimately dependent upon somebody else, somebody to recognize who I am, what I've done, what I've accomplished in my life, in order for me to receive that honor and to get that award. So even honor, although it's noble and good, it's not completely self-sufficient. So it's dependent upon something other than itself in order for it really to be honor. Okay, so it doesn't quite meet that high standard that Aristotle has in mind when he's talking about happiness. Okay. So those are the three common views he takes up regarding happiness. But let's just kind of cut to the chase here. He thinks that happiness, contrary to popular views, is not an emotion, a feeling of any sort. It's not something that you have one minute, it's gone the next, or maybe you're happy one day but down the next. And that's really not what he's getting at here. What he's getting at here is the idea of human flourishing, or the idea of how to live well, how to achieve excellence as a human being. The question of happiness, we can say, really gets down to how to flourish, right? How to achieve the excellence that only a human being can achieve. And Aristotle gives a pretty famous definition of happiness, I mean, at least for Aristotle anyway. He defines happiness as an activity in accordance with virtue, both the moral and the intellectual virtues. So happiness boils down to an activity. It's an activity that's connected with virtue. So if we want to pursue happiness, which he thinks we all do, if we want to achieve happiness and flourish as a human being, we have to understand more about this concept of virtue. Okay, and in particular, the moral virtues that we're going to look at here. So that brings up the question of what is virtue? Okay, so he's telling us here that happiness is somehow connected to virtue. The next question we would want to raise is, what is virtue? And as you read for this week, virtue is a middle ground between two extremes for Aristotle. And we'll look at the list of the moral virtues next. But before doing that, let's just back up and come up with a broad, general definition of virtue. It comes from the Greek arte, and it means the excellence of a specific type of thing that marks the peak of that thing and permits it to perform its characteristic work or task well. Okay, so that's a mouthful there. Let's try to break that down into more simple terms here. So virtue has to do with the perfection of something. And virtue doesn't just apply to human beings. So it's real common to hear not only Aristotle, but Plato and Socrates refer to the virtue of a horse, for example. And what they mean by that is the perfection or the excellence of that horse. So we could say that it's achieved virtue when it's really performing its work that it's meant to perform and doing it very well. Okay, it's almost like it's reaching that pinnacle of perfection. Okay, so we would say it's achieved its virtue. Now, obviously, not all things are going to live up to that standard. So, virtue is one of those lofty ideals, right, that not everything will measure up to. But it really gets down to the excellence of that thing. And the excellence of it enables that thing, whether it's a human being or an animal or an inanimate object, to perform its work well, right? To be able to function the way it's supposed to function, to be able to do its job well. Applied to human beings, because that's really what we're talking about here in ethics. We're not worried about the virtue of horses, but so applied to human beings, virtue, Aristotle writes, is a disposition or a character of soul whereby one performs good acts instinctively. Okay, virtue is a disposition or character of soul whereby one performs good acts or instinctively. So virtue relates to the human soul. It relates to the human person, and the human person performs their good acts habitually, instinctively. So they do what's good out of habit. They do what's good really without even thinking about it. For the video this week that we looked at, the video opens up with a person playing the piano. And the reason they put that in there, apart from the fact that it's pretty good music, is to hammer home the idea that for Aristotle, one becomes good by doing good things, or one becomes virtuous by practicing virtue. Just as you would become good playing the piano by practicing the piano, Aristotle thinks in order to become virtuous, you have to do virtuous acts. Or maybe you're a basketball player, or you're a runner. The only way that you become good at those activities is to practice, is to do it over and over, repetition, right? Doing the same workout over and over, perfecting your technique, perfecting your form. Aristotle, in his very concrete, practical way of doing ethics, really thinks that virtue is achieved and perfected the same way, by practice, by doing it over and over. So over time, one develops a character where you just instinctively do what's right. Just like the piano player isn't really thinking about, okay, what key to hit, okay, which one comes next. I mean, they've done it so much that it's automatic to them. Or think of the person playing the guitar, right? So if you've learned to play the guitar, you know it takes a lot of practice. I mean, it takes a lot of work in order to learn the different chords and how to move your fingers. But once you've learned it and you've perfected it, you really don't have to think about it. You just get on the guitar and you just start playing away. And that's what Aristotle has in mind here with virtue, that virtue would be no different than any skill or technique that you might learn. You're going to learn it and develop it by practicing it, by doing it over and over. So he thinks that virtue is something, once it's developed in the character of the person, will be performed instinctively. Okay, and when that person has achieved that state,